Today we're going to be starting Unit 3, Art History. In the grade 12 year, we focus on modern art. And I always begin this unit with just some basic questions like, what is art? Why study art? Why is it relevant? Why is it important? And in this video here that we'll watch together, various professionals in the arts industry make a valid point that the arts are important to have. The arts are related to creativity, they lead to innovation, and what our world really needs right now is a lot more of that, right? Creativity and innovation. And the arts have always inspired that in people and individuals around the world. Yes, math and science, those are wonderful subjects, but I don't think it's fair to overlook the arts because they bring a lot of value to the world and to people's lives as well.
There's a deep desire in us to make pictures. I mean, they've been drawing for 30,000 years. The teaching of drawing is teaching people to look. That's what it's doing.
It was really when I was at art school that I started to see the relationship between history, philosophy, politics, and art. Prior to that, I thought that art was just making pretty pictures. Actually, art is connected to, life.
You can't teach art in the same way you can teach French. French exists whether you do it or not. But when you're doing art, the center of doing art is in yourself. Most of the literate subjects do not ask that of them. So this develops an entirely different realm of skill.
Creativity is critical thinking. And without it, how are you going to really open up and ask harder questions? And art opens all of those kind of passages and possibilities to think beyond what we already know.
In a child's education, that doors need to be opened to other universes, other modes of thinking. And art is a non-prescribed, dangerous world full of possibility. And I think it's a vital space for children to have in the formative years of their education.
From a top-down level, you don't have innovation if you don't have arts. It's as simple as that.
It doesn't matter if you're going to study history or geography or science, you still need to be creative, because the people who are the outliers in those fields are the most creative people. To have art in schools be eroded, which is happening at the moment, is disastrous for Britain, I think, because our best industry is the creative industry.
Art and cultural production is at the very center of what makes a society what it is. And for an entire new generation not to know what is the cultural and visual history of ourselves is kind of denying our own identity.
Art is a reflection of the society that we are, the kind of mirror that art holds up, the way that art helps define the identity of a nation, that you can trace that back historically. It's deeply embedded in humanity.
What art education does to people who are not going to be artists is giving them the opportunity to build certain aspect of themselves that otherwise will be either ignored, undeveloped, or repressed.
It's all about kids finding out who they are, and they're all different.
That you can be whatever you want to be is something that art certainly taught me. It can access a part of your brain, body, spirit, mind that nothing else can.
Nothing is more stimulating, exciting, consoling than looking at a brilliant painting.
Art in schools shouldn't be sidelined. I think it should be right there, right up in the front, because I think art teaches you to deal with the world around you. It's the oxygen that actually makes all the other subjects breathe.
There's a great quote by John Ruskin. Art shows us what it is to be human. And really that's why art should be on the curriculum.
All right, so here's this great little video, and it has to do with this question: who decides what art means? Many times we've been to maybe art galleries, museums, and we've stood there and often wondered, what does this painting mean? Or what does this piece of art mean? And of course, we can apply our own meaning to it. There's of course the artist's applied meaning that's also needs to be considered when looking also at a piece of art. But it is a very complex question, and this is what this video sort of explores.
Imagine you and a friend are strolling through an art exhibit and a striking painting catches your eye. The vibrant red appears to you as a symbol of love, but your friend is convinced it's a symbol of war. And where you see stars in a romantic sky, your friend interprets global warming inducing pollutants. To settle the debate, you turn to the internet, where you read that the painting is a replica of the artist's first grade art project. Red was her favorite color, and the silver dots are fairies. You now know the exact intentions that led to the creation of this work. Are you wrong to have enjoyed it as something that the artist didn't intend? Do you enjoy it less now that you know the truth? Just how much did the artist's intention affect your interpretation of the painting? It's a question that's been tossed around by philosophers and art critics for decades, with no consensus in sight. In the mid-20th century, literary critic W.K. Wimsatt and philosopher Monroe Beardsley argued that artistic intention was irrelevant. They called this the intentional fallacy, the belief that valuing an artist's intentions was misguided. Their argument was twofold. First, the artists we study are no longer living, never recorded their intentions, or are simply unavailable to answer questions about their work. Second, even if there were a bounty of relevant information, Wimsatt and Beardsley believed it would distract us from the qualities of the work itself. They compared art to a dessert. When you taste a pudding, the chef's intentions don't affect whether you enjoy its flavor or texture. All that matters, they said, is that the pudding works. Of course, what works for one person might not work for another. And since different interpretations appeal to different people, the silver dots in our painting could be reasonably interpreted as fairies, stars, or pollutants. By Wimsatt and Beardsley's logic, the artist's interpretation of her own work would just be one among many equally acceptable possibilities. If you find this problematic, you might be more in line with Stephen Knapp and Walter Ben Michaels, two literary theorists who rejected the intentional fallacy. They argued that an artist's intended meaning was not just one possible interpretation, but the only possible interpretation. For example, suppose you're walking along a beach and come across a series of marks in the sand that spell out a verse of poetry. Knapp and Michaels believed the poem would lose all meaning if you discovered these marks were not the work of a human being, but an odd coincidence produced by the waves. They believed an intentional creator is what makes the poem subject to understanding at all. Other thinkers advocate for a middle ground, suggesting that intention is just one piece in a larger puzzle. Contemporary philosopher Noel Carroll took this stance, arguing that an artist's intentions are relevant to their audience the same way a speaker's intentions are relevant to the person they're engaging in conversation. To understand how intentions function in conversation, Carroll said to imagine someone holding a cigarette and asking for a match. You respond by handing them a lighter, gathering that their motivation is to light their cigarette. The words they use to ask the question are important, but the intentions behind the question dictate your understanding and ultimately your response. So which end of this spectrum do you lean towards? Do you, like Wimsatt and Beardsley, believe that when it comes to art, the proof should be in the pudding? Or do you think that an artist's plans and motivations for their work affect its meaning? Artistic interpretation is a complex web that will probably never offer a definitive answer. Did you know that TED-Ed has a program dedicated to...
All right, so that was a very interesting video, and just it's something to keep in mind, right, to consider. It's a complex world when we get into what does this art piece mean? There's so much that it could mean, right? So anyway, that was an interesting video. All right, so we're going to be starting modern art. And I know for maybe many of you might be thinking modern art, Miss. So is that something that's been done lately? No, I know the language can sometimes sound confusing and a little bit misleading, but let's take a look at this video of how ancient art influenced modern art. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the modern era period.
The term modern art sounds like it means art that is popular at the moment. But in fact, modern art is a style that originated over 150 years ago and includes artists that by now have attained classic status, such as Picasso, Matisse, and Gauguin. And what's even more ironic is that the movement they pioneered, considered revolutionary and even scandalous at the time, was inspired largely by an object of a traditional and ancient design. As far back as the Renaissance, the primary European art movements emphasized conventional representation and adherence to classical forms. But that began to change in the late 19th century, as artists like Van Gogh and Cézanne expanded the boundaries of painting. Soon, a movement arose that sought to create an entirely new style of art. And one way of doing so was to look beyond Western civilization. For example, Paul Gauguin moved to the island of Tahiti in the 1890s. There, he found inspiration in the island's inhabitants, landscape, and culture to create artwork that intertwined European themes and Polynesian lore. Others looked to the cultures of the Islamic world, but the most influential inspiration would come from sub-Saharan Africa. As European empires expanded deeper into the African continent, its artifacts and artworks made their way into the hands of museums and collectors. One such collector was Henri Matisse, who showed his friend Picasso a mask he had acquired, made by the Dan tribe of the Ivory Coast. The mask awoke Picasso's curiosity, leading him to visit the Trocadero Ethnographic Museum in Paris in 1907. Founded to house acquisitions from colonial conquests, the museum boasted a collection of African with stylized figures and masks made of wood and decorated with simple colors and materials. The visit was a revelation for Picasso, who proclaimed that African masks were what painting was all about. At this time, Picasso had been working on a painting of 5 nude women in a style that would later come to be known as Cubism. And while 3 of these ladies show facial features found in ancient Iberian art, a nod to Picasso's Spanish heritage, the faces of the 2 on the right closely resemble African masks. Created in 1907 after hundreds of sketches and studies, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon has been considered the first truly 20th century masterpiece, breaking with many previously held notions in art. It was at once aggressive and abstract, distorted yet primal in its raw geometry, a new artistic language with new forms, colors, and meanings. And these avant-garde qualities caused a sensation when the painting was first exhibited almost 10 years later. The public was shocked, critics denounced it as immoral, and even Picasso's own friends were simultaneously surprised, offended, and mesmerized at his audacity. More artists soon followed in Picasso's footsteps. Constantine Brancusi and Amedeo Modigliani in Paris, as well as the German Expressionists, all drew on the aesthetics of African sculptures in their work. Others looked to a different continent for their inspiration. British sculptor Henry Moore based many of his semi-abstract bronze sculptures on a replica of a Chak Mool, a distinctive reclining statue from the Toltec Maya culture. Pre-Columbian art was also a major influence for Josef Albers. He created a series of compositions, such as the geometrical series, Homage to the Square, that were inspired by pyramids and local art he encountered on his frequent visits to Mexico. Inspiration from ancient cultures initiated one of the most revolutionary movements in art history, but were these artists playing the role of explorers or conquistadors, appropriating ideas and profiting from cultures they considered primitive? Questions like this deserve scrutiny as artists continue to redefine standards. Perhaps not too long from now, the bold innovations of modern art will seem like stale orthodoxies, ready to be overturned by a new set of radical trailblazers drawing inspiration from another unlikely source.
All right, so the modern art era took place between the 1860s to the 1970s. So how do you define it? There is no precise definition for the term modern art, although it usually refers to works produced during the approximate period of 1870 to 1970. Typically, modern artists rejected previous Renaissance-based traditions in favor of new forms of artistic experimentation. Okay, so in grade 11 art, much of the focus is on the Renaissance in terms of art history. The Renaissance was a period of rebirth. That's what Renaissance means. But it was very much focused on classical, sort of naturalistic, the wanting to go back to sort of classical art in terms of Roman and Greek art and how the human body was presented. A lot of religious themes were also showcased in a lot of Renaissance art. And so with modern art, there was this desire to move away from the traditional, to move away from this aesthetic that was starting to get sort of tiresome. Okay, so of course, with any new group of people or with any generation, there's always this deep need to move forward, to desire change or to implement change. Okay, so materials used. They used new materials, new techniques of painting, and developed new theories about how art should reflect the perceived world and what their functions as artists should be. In addition, entirely new types of art were developed during the period. When did it begin? According to most art critics, modernism in painting first started with the Frenchman Jean-Claude Monet and the French Impressionists for its rejection of traditional academic art forms from the 18th and 19th century. So artists, in other words, were ready for some changes. All right, so the rejection of traditional academic art forms. So modern art saw a shift from the traditional art forms to do different, or basically to use different types of media like photography, collage, assemblage, different use of space and architecture, the high-rise buildings such as skyscrapers, significant rise in abstract and non-representational art. There's a lot of social and political transformation that was happening. And then artists were eager for change. So for art history, we're basically going to be touching upon the different styles that emerged during the modern art era. Okay, so the first style that emerged is what we're going to be talking about today: Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Okay, the other styles that developed, we're going to be dedicating that to each day of the week. So for example, on Tuesday, we're going to talk about the next style: Expressionism, Fauvism, Abstract Expressionism. On Wednesday, we're going to discuss Cubism. On the fourth day, which would be Thursday, we're going to talk about Surrealism. And the fifth day, we're going to just focus primarily on pop art. If we have the opportunity to discuss minimalism, we will. Okay. All right, so what is Impressionism? Okay, this is a short, quick video that kind of explains it and also provides some great visuals.
Impressionist paintings are among the most loved and celebrated artworks of all time. But what is Impressionism, and who were the great Impressionist artists? Impressionism is perhaps one of the most identifiable and famous art movements of history. Often referred to as the first modern movement, it was born in April 1874 when a group of young artists defied the official Paris Salon by setting up their own independent exhibition. Including works by Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, Edgar Degas, and Berthe Morisot, it became known as the first Impressionist exhibition. The Impressionist work was characterized by loosened brushwork and lightened palettes, including pure, intense colors. They abandoned traditional linear perspective and often avoided the clarity of form. For this reason, many critics faulted Impressionist paintings for their unfinished appearance and seemingly amateurish quality. Collectively, the Impressionists sought to capture the impression of a scene through lively brushstrokes, and they often worked on plein air, producing works of art rapidly in a single sitting. Rejecting the Salon's preference for historical or allegorical subjects, they created instead what Monet called a spontaneous work rather than a calculated one. In the 1870s, many of the Impressionist painters were predominantly attracted to landscape, searching for ways to capture the fleeting effects of light, weather, and time of day on canvas. By the 1880s, artists looked beyond landscapes. Renoir turned towards figure painting. Monet considered visual perspective in a more abstract way through seriality and repetition, and Degas pursued female figures. Yet each retained the distinctive rapid brushstrokes, fresh colours, and sense of internal light unique to Impressionism. Much like the French realists, changing Parisian life and the reality of the modern city was a recurring theme for many Impressionists, who painted cafe scenes, railway bridges, and busy boulevards. Although the group was dominated by men, several female artists also rose to prominence, including Morisot and Cassatt. When the first Impressionist exhibition was held in 1874, Berthe Morisot joined the group and agreed never again to send work to the Salon. Morisot was a faithful exhibitor at all 8 Impressionist exhibitions from 1874 to 1886. Like the other Impressionist painters, she was preoccupied by capturing light, but she also used broad strokes of colour that echo what she had observed in Manet's work. As the first modern art movement, Impressionism had a significant impact on subsequent artists and movements, with artists like Vincent van Gogh and Edvard Munch among those influenced. More recent influences include the important pop artist Roy Lichtenstein, who paid homage to Monet's water lily paintings. The aesthetic qualities of Impressionism can be seen widely through its ubiquitous popularity and impact on our culture today.
All right. So that's basically Impressionism in a nutshell, okay, but I'm going to discuss it a little bit further with you. All right, so the major Impressionist artists of this period or of this style were Manet, Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Cassatt were the major artists of this time period. Okay, so here we have a painting, and this is something that is very well known. And it basically is a painting of a sunrise. And the painting here that we see is very much emphasizing lightness, right? There's a lot of light color use here, so light pastels. Many artists in the Impressionist period were very much interested and focused on how light hit objects, how light affected the appearance of things. And so here you have an example of this beautiful painting, and this is what basically Impressionists were sort of fascinated by. So this is a really great example. All right, so our first artist here is Claude Monet. He is one of the leaders of the French Impressionist movement. He's a master of color and painter of light effects, okay? So about the work that we see in here, this is one of his very famous paintings. Again, his focus is constantly exploring light, all right, in a lot of his art pieces. His techniques are small, loose brushworks, fuzzy edges, use of complementary colors for shadows. His technical approach, so yes, he's considered an intellectual classical artist because he painted what he saw instead of what he felt. There's no definite edges of contours, it's optical mixing, small loose brushstrokes, effects of light. Okay, so we can see this here in his studies of the cathedrals. Okay, so Monet was someone who would spend most of his days documenting how the sunlight would hit a building. So this is what we see with cathedrals. And he would do a whole bunch of these, a whole series of paintings of just looking at the light and how it affects the building at different periods of the day. So this is what he would be doing for most of his time, okay? So he has a lot of artwork where it's just cathedrals. And it's just at different points of the day here. Okay, all right. Here's a painting done in 1919, Le Bassin au Nymphia. This painting is worth, I believe it, $82.2 million. I'm sure it's gone up since the last time I did this presentation. But a lot of his paintings by Monet, are very, very popular, and they are very, very well known, meaning they are very valuable. Okay, so here's some more of his artwork. And again, what is he doing? He's exploring light. Right. This next artist here is someone that you guys might know or might not know. His name is Pierre-Auguste Renoir. Renoir enjoyed creating beautiful, joyful scenes of Parisian life. So that's what we see here. Okay. Worked very closely with Monet. So a lot of these Impressionist artists lived somewhat close, and they were known to be friendly with each other. He used professional models and friends to pose for him. Females were his primary subjects. In terms of his technical approach, there's this phrase called en plein air, at least some of the studies, which means he liked to paint, a lot of these artists painted in the moment, right? They tried to capture the moment. He is another one who also liked to use complementary colors for shadow, and very much used the loose brushstrokes, very much like Monet. Okay. Here's another artist. Now, I know it's very confusing, right? We have Monet and Manet. So Edouard Manet, he was one of the first 19th century artists to paint modern life and a pivotal figure in the transition from realism to Impressionism. He was also a classical artist, kind of like Monet, but then adopted notions of Impressionism as time went on. He became friends with other Impressionist artists, and they influenced each other. So most well known for his social scenes, kind of like what you see here. Okay, some of his artwork is quite breathtaking. Now, some of you might, oh, I've seen this painting before. Oh, so that's the guy. That's often what happens. All right, so we have Edgar Degas. He was born in 1834 and died in 1917. He cropped subjects awkwardly. He liked to show emotional tension in his artwork, and he chose unusual viewpoints linked to his fascination with photography. He captured snapshots, painted ballerinas because they sold well. All right, so here's an example. And we have Mary Cassatt. Now, the reason I bring her up is she's one of the only, or one of the very few Impressionist painters that was in existence and was female. So she's an American painter born in Allegheny City, went to art school in Philadelphia, where only 20% of the studies were female. Or students were female, my apologies. None of which were as determined as Mary Cassatt to making a painting career. She moved to Paris and met Degas, who influenced her painting. Again, here's some of her artwork. Again, she's really capturing a lot of the characteristics of Impressionism, right? The short brush strokes, the capturing of light, the fuzziness of the figures, right? They're accurate. You can still tell they're human, and some of the features are accurate, the proportions are accurate, but there is a little bit of that haziness, that fuzziness there. All right, so after Impressionism, there's something called post-Impressionism, which means after Impressionism. Okay, so it comes after Impressionism, originates in France as well. Many of the Impressionists moved towards post-Impressionism ideas. So who's a very famous post-Impressionist? Van Gogh, and he's my ultimate favorite artist of all time. So let's take a look of one of his very famous paintings. I'm sure many of you know it, The Starry Night.
Yeah, you know this picture. You can probably name its creator and at least one detail about his life. And I bet you know the title too. I mean, heck, you might have even done the puzzle. It depicts some trees, a town, and of course a night sky, something we've all seen in one form or another. So what's so special about it? Is it the image itself that enchants us, the thickly applied whorls of paint, or is it the story of the tortured artist behind it? Let's better know the Starry Night. When Vincent van Gogh, and yes, I'm going to try to say my own botched version of his Dutch name, painted the picture in June of 1889, rapid industrial development was underway in much of Western Europe and the world. Railroads made travel easier than ever. Carl Benz had begun to sell the first commercially available motor wagon. The first skyscrapers were going up. The Moulin Rouge opened that year in Paris, along with that kind of famous structure, the Eiffel Tower, marking the entrance to that year's World's Fair. Charlie Chaplin was born in 1889, followed 4 days later by Adolf Hitler. That year, Mark Twain published A Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Nellie Bly circumnavigated the globe in 72 days. And Chef Raffaele Esposito invented the pizza margherita. In the wider world of art, Impressionism was out. The more methodical, scientifically rigorous Neo-Impressionism was in. And Cézanne and the artists who would later be called Post-Impressionists were bubbling up. Rather than making new optical impressions of the world like the Impressionists, these artists were more interested in expressing their emotional and psychological impressions through style, symbol, and bold use of color. Our man Vincent was among them. Born in the Netherlands in 1853, he bounced around Europe throughout his teens and early 20s until returning home in 1880, committed to becoming a great painter. His surroundings became his subject matter, developing his skills as a draftsman and painter, using a mostly dark palette to document rural landscapes, still lifes, and Dutch peasants. He moved around Europe and eventually made his way to Paris in 1886. There, he encountered and metabolized the work of the Impressionists and collected Japanese prints. We can see his brushwork loosen and palette brighten, but he found the city frantic, overwhelming, and cold, and decided to move south to Arles, where he embraced what he thought of as a more pure subject matter, the countryside, more still lifes, a small town, and its residents who became his friends. He depicted the changing seasons with an increasingly acute and intense attention to color. Vincent corresponded frequently with his younger brother Theo, who supported him both financially and emotionally. In his letters, Vincent sensitively and eloquently shares thoughts about art, life, and his unrelenting struggle with his mental health. On April 9, 1888, he wrote to Theo, "I must also have a starry night with cypresses, or perhaps above all a field of ripe corn. There are some wonderful nights here." That summer, he painted several night scenes, which he found to be, quote, much more alive and richly colored than the day. A gaslit interior of Café de la Gare, a portrait of his friend Eugène against a starry sky, and the banks of the River Rhône at night. Night was not a new preoccupation for painters, and Van Gogh was certainly aware of his contemporaries' efforts. While productive, he longed for contact with other artists. So Theo arranged for Paul Gauguin, who'd been painting in Brittany, to come his way in October of '88 for artistic exchange and to be Vincent's roomie. But it didn't last long. The two disagreed, and by the end of December, Gauguin was gone, and Vincent suffered a psychological crisis that involved his infamous mutilation of his own ear. In 1889, he entered himself into an asylum at Saint-Rémy, situated at the foot of the Alpilles Mountains, and it's here that he painted our picture in question, one of many he made of the landscape that surrounded him. He wrote to Theo, "This morning I saw the countryside from my window a long time before sunrise, with nothing but the morning star, which looked very big." Now, there are a number of ways this picture is not accurate. He couldn't see the town from his window, and even if he could, the steeple didn't look like the one he painted, which bears closer resemblance to the steeples of his native Holland. The morning star is probably Venus, which he could have seen, but at the time the moon was unlikely to have been a crescent, but instead a waning gibbous. The dramatic swirling patterns in the sky, which dominate the canvas, do kinda sorta match then published observations of spiral nebulae or galaxies, but they wouldn't have been visible to him. Some studies claim the swirling sky and radiating stars demonstrate luminance, with scaling similar to that of the mathematical theory of turbulence. Some have even linked this depiction of physical turbulence with times of psychological turbulence for Van Gogh, but other theorists convincingly speculate the swirls represent, wait for it, wind. clouds propelled by the mistral, the strong northwesterly wind of Provence that the artist wrote of. Accuracy is not the point. The picture is based on observation and memories of places, but is driven by emotion. The sky is painted wet on wet, executed quickly and confidently. The composition is superbly balanced. The vertical of the cypresses and steeple counteract the horizontal of the town and stabilize the diagonal of the tumbling mountain range. The town is still, emphasizing the dramatic action everywhere else. The hills are rolling, the cypresses flicker like flames, and the sky is in spectacular motion. There are many interpretations of this piece. Cypress are often associated with the afterlife, a bridge between the earth and heaven, and Vincent wouldn't live much more than a year after the painting's creation, dying by suicide in July of 1890. Some see the painting as inspired by a religious mood, or achieved in a state of heightened reality or great agitation. But the evidence doesn't show this. He had written of the vast peace and majesty of the night sky, in fact, and wrote, "The sight of the stars always makes me dream." Theo didn't love the piece and wrote, "I think that the search for some style is prejudicial to the true sentiment of things." But it's style that Vincent was desperately seeking, which he had committed to discovering for himself. Back in 1874, he wrote to his brother, "Painters understand nature and love it, and teach us to see." With Starry Night, Van Gogh does just that. He teaches us to see the sky, not as it looks, but perhaps as it feels. This image is universal in that we've all looked out on a night sky, but never have we seen it quite like this. In a career that lasted only a decade, Van Gogh articulated a style that we can't forget, that continues to draw crowds and captivate us. The Starry Night inspired Don McLean in 1971 to write a song about its misunderstood creator, never appreciated during his lifetime, which was played on repeat in 1996 in Tupac Shakur's hospital room as he died. Vincent's life story has been adapted to film on a number of occasions, including the recent Loving Vincent, a fully painted animated film that brings the Starry Night, among other works, to life. But the Starry Night stands for much more than the search for recognition or immortality. With this work, we feel our smallness standing on the earth and the hugeness that lies above and beyond. We feel the striving and the desire to share with others the world not as it is, but as we see it. If you're interested in better knowing the why behind things we encounter every
All right. So here are some of the well-known post-impressionist artists, and they include Vincent van Gogh, Paul Cézanne, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, and Georges Seurat. So characteristics of post-impressionism: it's very emotional, and it has much more of a romantic approach, but there is a little bit more of a intellectual style still present. Is that confusing? Yes, but it depends on the individual artist. So there's two main directions of post-impressionism. The first direction was concentration on form and design, which is something that Seurat and Cézanne very much focused on. The emotional and sensuous expression, that was something that Van Gogh and Gauguin very much focused on, and that was more so their interest, okay? Van Gogh and Gauguin were basically the precursor to abstract expressionism, which is the next style of the modern era. All right, so characteristics of post-impressionism. So combined color and light with planned compositions of traditional paintings. Work can have a Japanese feel. That is because they were influenced by Japanese prints. Okay, so a lot of post-impressionist work, there's echoes of Japanese style artwork or prints very much there. Okay, it's very noticeable. The outline shapes, influence of Japanese prints, the 2D shapes of color, some use of small brush strokes especially. Paul Cézanne, his work has a sculptural feel in a lot of his art. He paints in a systemic order. He leads the way for future art movements like Fauvism, Cubism, and Expressionism. He has an intellectual approach to post-impressionism, and his technical approaches focuses on form and design. Hints of geometric shapes begin to occur, some flat areas of color, and less of an atmospheric perspective feel. So a lot of the Impressionists and post-impressionists were trying to move away from the Renaissance linear perspective. They just wanted to have a little bit more freedom with that. And here's an example of a painting done by him. And you guys can sort of see the geometric aspect starting to show. Okay, yes, there's that fuzziness and haziness with the brushstrokes, but there also is some definitive shapes that we can see, especially in the houses. George Seurat develops a technique called pointillism. He has an intellectual approach as well. His technical approach is he uses small brushstrokes. Sorry about that. Let's go back here. He uses small brushstrokes but primarily he does pointillism. Basically, so like little dots of paint take up the majority of his pieces. I think we've all at some point done art in elementary school or even high school where we were asked to create a pointillism piece, right? Where it was just a whole bunch of like little dots that were taking up the whole page, and they were very tedious to do and they took forever and it never felt like it got done. But that essentially is pointillism, and that's what George Seurat sort of explored in a lot of his artwork. And this is a piece that I think everyone has seen. It's very popular in pop culture. It's called The Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Les Grandes Jattes. Okay, it's an oil on canvas. And what people I think often don't realize is this is all done in pointillism. So small little dots. And it's not a tiny canvas, it's quite a big canvas. So if you look at this piece, a lot of people are scratching their heads going like, how long did this take? You know? So there's many symbols in this artwork, representation of Parisian life. He mixes all the social classes in one work, right? Sometimes as a viewer of art, we can all say, oh, that's nice. But we have to kind of look beyond, oh, that looks nice. What is there? What is the artist trying to show us? What is his message? And I think this is something that is really important, and I try to emphasize this with grade 12 students who are planning even to pursue this in college or university. Your analysis skills have to be top-notch. It's taking the time to look at something, but looking even deeper, making connections to the world, making connections to even your own life, and understanding the bigger picture of what the artist is trying to say. All right, so Paul Gauguin, he abandons his family, career, and moves to Tahiti to paint, okay? So he has a very unique sort of story in the sense that unlike some of the other post-impressionists or impressionists where a lot of them stayed in Europe, he decided, I'm out of here. I need a new place to do my art. His technical approach, he focuses on form and design. Hints of geometric shapes begin to occur, flat areas of color, less of atmospheric perspective. And there's also a Japanese influence in a lot of his artwork. And here's some examples. All right, this is Vincent van Gogh's The Bedroom. Okay, so Van Gogh may have been expression of feeling. Oh, sorry, let me reread that. Sorry. Van Gogh may have been expressing a feeling of loneliness after his close friend Paul Gauguin moves away. He includes 2 chairs in this painting here. So this is what I'm talking about, analysis. And what is the artist trying to say? For someone who, you know, this is his bed, this is where he spends most of his time, why have 2 chairs instead of 1, right? And basically, it's to highlight in maybe a more subtle way that his good friend has now left him and now he's all alone. So it's just very interesting how an artist can still touch upon these things with maybe very subtle objects in a painting. So his technical approach, use of color is more intense and emotional. Small brushstrokes, also has emotion. Doesn't use white or focus on the effect of light. There's a lot of flat color. Perspective is off. Okay, so if we look at this painting, if you guys have ever done 1-point perspective drawings or 2-point perspective drawings, you know that this is not entirely accurate. But of course with Van Gogh, that was never his intention. He was very much interested in the emotions of things and the feelings of things and how they were painted and how they reflected his style. Okay. Then we have Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. He is a commercial artist and created posters for nightclubs. So this particular artist here is interesting because he was one of the beginning individuals that really started the whole advertisement and like poster design movement, right? So he's sort of like one of the pioneers that sort of started this whole way of getting art out there, and also having art in a different sort of environment where it was printed on a printing press as opposed to being painted or illustrated by an artist. So it all sort of started with this individual here. He created many posters for Moulin Rouge. Lautrec was the first artist to elevate advertising to the status of a fine art. Okay, so big shift for history. And that's what I was referring to. There was all of a sudden this focus on art, and it suddenly shifted into this new thing called advertising. Okay, so Japanese print influence. And here is some of his artwork. Okay, so a little bit more about him. Thanks to his childhood tutor, also an art therapist, who encouraged him to shift his energy from writing to drawing, a safer pursuit for a child struggling with illness. Toulouse-Lautrec's early passion for physical activity was channeled directly into his art. The breathless excitement and athleticism of his sinuous line is like muscle memory, physical energy transposed into art. So by sheer force of will, Toulouse-Lautrec turned his disability into a superpower at a time when the only acceptable designation for persons with disabilities was a freak. Toulouse-Lautrec used his unique appearance to his advantage. It allowed him to disappear into a crowd or the corners of a bedroom, seeing others without being seen. Okay. So, of course, his remarkable observational skills very much helped him when he was creating his pieces of art. He loved to draw crooners, dancers, acrobats. He even drew a lot of prostitutes with whom he socialized. They were basically sort of, I hate to say it, some of the outcasts, right, became sort of his family. People that, you know, didn't have much of their own family or much of their own sort of community. He found solace with them. He identified with them, and there is every indication that he saw them as equals. All right, so more than simply a brilliant advertiser and artist, Toulouse-Lautrec was an important informal visual historian of urban life in Belle Epoque Paris. The film Moulin Rouge and other period pieces based on the Belle Epoque are heavily informed by his posters, prints, and paintings. Okay, so discussion. So we're going to be creating, or you're going to be creating, a Venn diagram on a sheet of paper. So whatever sheet of paper you have around you, a lined sheet of paper is fine for something like this, and identify how Impressionism and Post-Impressionism differ from each other, and then make note of what they have in common. We will then discuss these items or this Venn diagram that you create in groups. Okay, so for one circle, identify it as Impressionism up at the top. The other circle, identify it as Post-Impressionism, right? In the center, you're putting what they have in common. On the individual sides of each circle, you are identifying the things that they don't have in common that are very unique to that particular art style, okay? So you're just trying to look at some of the things I've presented to you, some of the notes that I've also sort of referred to you to explain to you the difference between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. You want to make note of them, and then we're going to share them, and we're going to see what we come up with. Some of you will have them all listed, and some of you might point out some things that I maybe even didn't really think about or missed. And we're just going to share. So we have a very clear understanding of these two particular styles and movements within the modern art period. Okay, so we're going to come back during our synchronous time, and we're going to have these discussions. I will see you guys then.